Good evening, everybody. My aim is to show that transport planning is alive and well, although you might notice that we don't seem to produce transport plans anymore. But we do need them, in my view, and I want to set out why I think we need them in a new form, why they're valuable, and how they should be developed. This is an entirely personal view. It's not a sort of CILT policy statement. It's not the views of my colleagues in Steer FCILT either, and I'm sure you'll find there are many things I have to say that you, esteemed audience, don't agree with either. But it is my view, and it is based on 45 years of being a transport planner, which is probably an unusual thing. So, coming here to meet in central London, served by a well-funded public transport system, restored, perhaps we could say, to rude health, admired by visitors from around the globe, you might be forgiven for thinking that transport planning must be doing just fine in the UK. Of course, it's not just the transport system that distinguishes London from the rest of the country. We can hardly fail to notice its economic resilience and growth. We might believe the two issues are linked, economic performance and the quality of its transport system. But we're going to need to look a little more deeply if we're to appreciate the really important and distinctive features of London's success in transport. I'd point out just two fundamental differences that explain, I think, a lot of London's success in transport for the last 10 or 15 years. The first is there is a statutory obligation, unique across England and Wales, for the Mayor of London to prepare and keep up to date a plan for London, a single source which sets out all aspects of London's future and some of it on a spatial basis. The second point is the wealth of London, especially in its business and property sector, which is such that it's now possible to draw in significant private sector funds to transport investment, especially public transport investment. And let's be clear, that particular type of prosperity, property and development based, exists in London and nowhere else in the UK. Now, before I go any further, I should say, just in case you sort of wonder what on earth he's talking about, that actually it's pretty, and I'm going to pretty much stick to this, it's written down and you get this in a booklet at the end, so you can sort of relax. But thinking about London, others are going to say, yeah, but, you know, the Mayor for London's got a unique set of powers. Think about TfL, very well resourced and led. But I'd say, in truth, city leaders, strong city leaders, achieve an awful lot without statutory powers. Anyway, we are getting ahead of ourselves. In this talk, I want to question the very notion of transport planning and its relevance today. So I'm going to review, first of all, how it started and evolved. Those are the sort of four areas I want to get through. Bring it up to date with what's happening today, ask the question, well, is there something missing? And then go on to thinking about transport planning at two levels, project level and a national level. So, starting at the beginning, I started this happy little career in transport planning at the very end of the 1960s, when I would say it was part of the way the nation believed its future should be shaped. A set of plans to be adopted, funded, and implemented, you could even say imposed. This was an era before public consultation. It was an era of protest movements, actually, in lieu of consultation, often fought with a passion. Consumer products existed. This is sort of history for young people. We had consumer products, but we didn't have consumerism, and we certainly didn't have consumer rights. Choices were for governments to exercise and determine nationally. Sir Colin Buchanan had published probably the only ever popular book on transport planning called Traffic in Towns in 1963. I was lucky enough to catch him in his last year lecturing at Imperial College. I was doing the master's course, and I have to say this is the only thing I can really distinctly remember him saying. He probably said lots of wise things, but he said, if you ever get the chance to speak in public, take it. So you're paying the price for that. The CILT has spent recently some time looking back over the last few decades of transport planning. Discussions ably chaired by Martin Richards, who's here somewhere this evening. He gathered together many of the what are to me luminaries of the profession, the people who were there in the formative years in the 1960s and 1970s. And some of them are here tonight. With sharp minds as ever. This was the era of the specialist. The ministry of the day established its mathematical advisory unit. What a phrase. To set the ground rules for demand forecasting and appraisal. The private sector, I have to say, blossomed. Shape of transport planning consultancies, who across the UK competed with one another to carry out land use transport studies, which became really quite the vogue. The city or place with the best thought out transport plan, I think fondly imagined it would win a little pot of gold and fulfill its dreams. And the winner, I think, looking back, of this unofficial contest was Newcastle, or I should probably say Tyne and Wear. Wisely, they'd worked out that it'd be a good idea to have a land use plan, something for the future of the whole region, and then worry about what transport system was needed to support it. And out of that, the reward was Tyne and Wear Metro. And so long ago, it's black and white. It's rather sweet, really. Which got opened in 1980. Here's our Queen opening it. But actually, the standard British transport planning studies, despite their title, gave very little consideration to land use other than to use a lot of zonally based data in what would become the standard four-stage modelling approach. And along with that standard approach came a standard study team that consisted of a project manager, this is consultants' world, a transport economist, an engineer, and a data analyst. These little teams roamed the world doing their urban transport studies. This 1960s-70s approach had a project timescale, I'm afraid, consumed by data collection and demand modelling, with a huge rush at the end, many months later, to get consistent results. The analysis used any number of growth assumptions: incomes, car ownership, household size, population growth, all that. But only at the very end of the process did anybody know which of the alternatives put up had won. And whatever that was the transport plan. It was pretty simple. Through the 70s and beyond, the demand modelling techniques improved out of recognition. But I have to say the transport planning outcomes in terms of progress on the ground, something the wider public could see, were increasingly hard to identify. Not for the first time, transport plans would seem expendable. With the deregulatory and privatization urges of the 1980s, the very idea of planning at the urban level, or anywhere, basically came into question. I recall a very senior, it wasn't Eugene, you're all right, very senior DFT official saying to me at the time, planning has failed. The market should decide, not some bureaucrat. The era of the expert in transport planning, along with a number of other professions, was basically coming to an end. So, in that world, the staple of public transport provision, bus services, would be deregulated, demunicipalised, denationalised, anything else you can think of, except in London. Bus companies were to work out for themselves what made commercial sense, and then local authorities would add back in, through competitive tendering, services, provide the funding for services at off-peak times. It's a very radical change in the way transport was provided. The net result was actually that the most cost-efficient form of public transport in Britain, again, aside from London, disappeared from the radar of those who could set out urban plans, because you didn't really know what a bus service would be. And instead, we got a kind of short-lived flowering of interest in light rail transit instead. The department itself, and I should be very cruel here, had periodic and not very successful forays into sort of comprehensive policy and planning. Thinks of RHTM, started in 1976, the Regional Highway Traffic Model, the London Corridor Studies of the 1980s, the Multimodal Studies of the 1990s, the Corridor Studies of the last decade, which were started and then finished with a change of government. And they didn't yield very much. If you look at those sources for significant developments across those decades in terms of transport planning steps forward, I'm afraid I think you're looking in the wrong place. Key initiatives in transport, I think, were successful as often as not, despite formal transport study processes, rather than because of them. Let me give you two London examples, Docklands Light Railway and the Jubilee Line extension, both of which the transport planning profession at the time could tell you represented bad value for money. So the people who initiated them had other motives, and the fact that they've since been successful really begs the question of why did we get it so wrong? But we did get it wrong. Many developments came about, I would contend, outside any clear framework or programme, and were often promoted in defiance of conventional wisdom, and sometimes despite, and this was one of them, despite the wishes of the Department for Transport. Promoted by some maverick minds, maybe in corporate entities, but typically by the private sector, and very rarely as part of fulfilling some wider vision, some wider plan. I think it's probably worth thinking that, well, really, if that's the way transport planning is going to be in future, we're going to have to think again. Of course, we've had decisions to proceed on things, and of course, transport planners have been engaged in those decisions. One thinks of decisions around airports, Terminals 4 and then Terminal 5 at Heathrow, and ports, the decisions around Felixstowe, and which got through, but not Dibden Bay in Southampton. But the essence of these things is they're decided in isolation. They're not part of fulfilling some wider vision. You can compare and contrast that, if you will, with the sort of approach adopted elsewhere. In France, for instance, national, regional, city funding of schemes has transformed urban public transport. From 1976 onwards, you needed an urban transport plan to get into that funding routine. It's a method they've used that's succeeded, I think, visibly in transforming French cities, most of which, it seems, now enjoy a modern light rail system, involvement of the private sector, sort of there through a concession model. Places like Angers, population 158,000 people, with an LRT line designed to serve a third of the population. It is a different world. It's only 20 miles away. Our own transport world, of course, moved from being almost entirely in the public sector in the 1980s. Let's think of bus companies, airports, the national airline, the national parcel service, the railways, the train services, the people who built the trains, the people who ran the hotels, the ferries, you name it. All the rolling stock manufacturers. Virtually all moved to the private sector. It's an extraordinary change. It was also a world in which the powers held at local or regional level gradually got whittled away. That doesn't make planning any easier. But just stepping back again, thinking of, say, the Greater London Development Plan, which was the great hope of strategic large-scale transport planning, well, that was abandoned in the early 70s. Just as would happen elsewhere in, say, the USA. The big plans for major urban roads went. President Eisenhower, interestingly enough, who, of course, introduced the interstate freeway program, did so on the basis that the freeways surely didn't need to go into cities anyway. So first of all, I know we all think, well, Los Angeles and so on, but there were many, many great battles over major highway schemes in the States. So I'm contending that it's actually easiest looking at this period to point to a string of transport planning failures, and I'm going to give you two, that had the unintended consequence of leading development and regeneration rather than a great series of successes. Well, the two are Covent Garden in London, where Steer FCILT set up its office in 1978. I thought it was, at the time, rather shabby, but rather chic, so a great place for an office and cheap. But of course, that all arose because of the failure of the plans to transform Covent Garden with a huge rail interchange and some highway schemes. The Temple Bar district in Dublin, which ever you've suffered a sort of hen or a stag night over there, will know what that is like now. I mean, it was the same thing. It was run-down warehousing, blighted by a major metro bus station project. I remember it well. You could even say that the Old Street roundabout, now hailed as the centre of Tech City, has achieved its status through the odd combination of being a singularly depressing, traffic-dominated streetscape with a single underground station on a very overcrowded tube line. Cheap rents, just what you need to get start-up businesses. Not the ideal basis for telling the story that will provide the good transport and businesses will follow. And there's one other area I need to touch on in the past. We had another massive policy failure that repeated itself through these decades. The perennial issues around supply and demand involve an important question to which economists agreed the answer in this city 50 years ago. You have to charge for road use. But aside from central London's unextended congestion charge and Nottingham's workplace parking scheme, we just seem incapable of implementing these things. The truth is, visible taxation is always a political torment, and that became clear in a recent decision. For instance, with the A14 upgrade. It's a pretty big project. It's £1.5 billion. But ministers, in the end, decided, no, we're not going to toll it. The same thing happened with the A3's Hindhead Tunnel a few years earlier. So I'd like to remind you of one of the conclusions of the Standing Committee for Trunk Road Assessment, SACTRA, 1999, and it concluded this: if transport prices are currently too low due to uncharged congestion or environmental effects, then a transport improvement could lead to additional costs for the economy. Well, all the research shows that road user prices, despite pretty high fuel costs in the last couple of years, are too low, and they don't cover all their external costs. certainly not congestion costs. Now that means that in general, and as things stand, sorry about this, guys, it's not the right thing to do to invest in expanding the road network. Intellectually, we can't really tackle the road network capacity shortfall as things stand by increasing road capacity. And in fact, SATRA went further and started saying it was interested in looking at ways of reducing road traffic. Nothing has come along, I think, since, and this is 15 years old now, to change that view of SATRA. We have actually no plans for major new road schemes in this country since the mid-1990s. I better qualify that. I better say England, because in Scotland they've still built a couple of motorways. So, this has all been looking backwards. We'll get up to date in a moment. What happened to 1960s transport planning? I have to say it fell into disuse, and much more recently, come the credit crunch, I think it probably appeared to be dispensable. I'm told that about a third of transport planners lost their jobs in 2009-10. After all, transport planning is hardly a frontline service. Austerity. And yet there is clearly a great deal of very excellent transport planning activity going on. There's new money being spent at the Department for Transport looking at appraisal techniques. First for a while, I'd say. So there's a lot going on, but not in the production of transport plans. Still, I think there's a lot of agreement out there. I think these things are all pretty well understood. We underspend. In public transport, we've got pretty high prices. Congestion costs us a lot of money. There's all kinds of ways of manipulating demand. I've made the point about pricing, but there are other things we can do. And we do know there are some pretty significant environmental and human health effects from using extensively private cars. And, you know, that is still true. We are the most car-intensive nation. We don't have the best road network, but we use cars proportionately more than any other major European nation. So what are we going to do? Well, I don't think we're going to become French. We're going to have to find our own way of moving this forward, and I, for one, am quite excited about it. So let's move on to where we are on with transport planning today and ask the question, what's missing? Well, let's start with a key question, which is, where does the money come from? How do projects get funded? This has been a battleground for a number of decades, with transport organisations trying to break free from annual budget rounds. It was one of the key motivations for the London Underground PPP, actually, to get it on a stable, periodic budget framework. Same argument was used to partly to support rail privatisation. We've now got 5-year regulatory periods applied to the rail sector and to the airport sector. And with these changes, I think we've had major steps forward in planning, in transport planning for those modes. Indeed, I think in the rail sector, we're seeing a serious stream of long-term planning looking beyond a 5-year horizon. Because once you've done it a couple of times, you realise it would be wise to think ahead. And this is a process which is well established. There's an independent regulator to balance what government says it can fund and what rail industry thinks it can deliver. That's a comprehensive and I would say pretty inclusive process. And there's a very important device in it which I think should feature in transport planning going forward, and that's the use of output specifications. It makes everything so much more visible. It demands that you answer the question, what are we trying to achieve? These are the very things that successive chairmen of the British Railways Board I remember quite a few of them. That's what they sought. What do you want from me, government? Just tell me. Of course, you never got an answer. That's what they sought. We now have that. It's a huge help. So output statements set the challenge, and the rail industry works out how it's going to deliver, and the regulator sort of tries to moderate it and settle it. It's a little bit of a shade, I'm sorry about this, of what the French did in the 1980s in their contracts, contrat du plan. Anyway, I think it's a jolly good system. I used it working for the Northern Way and setting some outputs from the Northern Hub scheme, which is now proceeding. The only limitation I can really observe about this kind of forward long-term planning is it kind of reaches a limitation when you ask people to think about other modes. Pretty good at looking at the rail sector and what it could do if you improved it and so on. We'll come back to that. Those arrangements, incidentally, for the rail sector are pretty likely to be adopted wholesale, I would guess, by the Highways Agency. So you're going to have the modes doing 5-year planning, doing long-term planning. The aviation sector, well, the Davis Commission is really doing the transport planning job on our key airports. Port infrastructure never seems to have been brought into this process. Governments always seem to be reluctant to have a national ports plan. Does it matter? Well, it does make access planning to ports quite difficult in practice. But I still would contend these things are really useful, solid building blocks. 5-year plans, longer-term plans based on individual modes on which to move forward and conduct transport planning. So you might think, well, the obvious thing to do is to kind of assemble them into one big national picture. Problem with that is all of these things are run on slightly different 5-year cycles with different arrangements, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's too big a leap. But I would select a number of areas for improving and going forward from there, from where we are today. I would think it would be pretty sensible in what is, after all, a very constrained world we live in, if in looking at infrastructure schemes for one mode, we think about the other modes at the same time. So, Lower Thames crossing, because the Dartford crossing is full, why haven't we looked at a rail crossing linking the rail networks of Kent and Essex at the same time? We haven't, and we don't. We have to think about the way things operate. Yes, it's true there's something about strategic freight interchanges in the national policy statements, but that's about it when it comes to linking things together and thinking about how they operate. And this may sound quaint, really, because we live in a world where, if you want to compete, come and join the party. But actually, when we're planning use of scarce resources, land, money, we might allow ourselves the thought that, well, if we do this for one mode, maybe we don't need to fund the others. These problems, I think, need to be addressed somewhere. It would certainly help if the Department for Transport, especially after it's restructured its rail function, was to be organised less along modal lines and more around these gaps and interfaces, and trying to foster a strong sense of partnership between the different agencies. But I think more than this, and more important than this, there's actually, if you look at transport planning today, one key component that's missing and should be given serious consideration. And I can say quite a few colleagues I've talked with about this in CILT think the same. What's missing is, and this goes back to land use and transport, what's missing is a national spatial plan. In truth, we're a huge way away from having such a thing. I mean, we've just sort of got rid of housing allocations and the like. We've partly liberalised land use planning policy. But think about it. If you don't have a national spatial strategy, what do you do when you come to forecast transport demand? You use basically continue as it is growth assumptions about where development will take place, where the population will grow. What we deny ourselves is the opportunity to consider, well, is that the best distribution? Is that the way that we can most easily accommodate development in future? If we just carry on as things are, I can tell you, and we'll come and look at this in a second, there's going to be a swamping of the southeast of England, the wider southeast. You might say, well, that's inevitable, it's market-driven. Well, maybe it is. But I think we should be entitled to ask the question, is that the best way? So, what I think a National Spatial Plan would do is give us the chance to ask those questions. But is anybody going to be persuaded we actually need to do any of these things? Because they probably sound a bit scary. Is there a pressing need, a burning deck, as it were? And I think for three reasons there is a burning deck here that says, hang on, you've got to decide what you're going to do. And those are the three factors I think are critical here: demographic growth, this little question of agglomeration, and changing use of transport modes. So very briefly, here's the population time bomb. When you do a transport investment appraisal, you're meant to look 60 years ahead. Well, allow 10 years to kind of ponder and plan and build something. That's a long way out. By then, this is the official ONS projection. They deny it's a forecast, but it is their projection. We're going to be looking at 85 million people in this country. Now, that's clearly a high growth by European standards. That's a population that is projected to be bigger than Germany's population, but it's not actually a growth rate that's particularly high by world standards. We sort of deny the existence of this. But, you know, in transport planning, where you're taking decisions that last for decades, it's really rather trivial to sort of say, well, look 20 years ahead because I'm comfortable with that, and I'll forget beyond that. Well, population growth of 15% or so in London, you know, London will do what it does and find a way to accommodate that. But it's also got the largest commuter catchment in Europe. My calculation is, off the back of an envelope, we're going to need about 3 new railway lines, or the equivalent of it, into London to cope with the commuter growth over the next few decades. Needless to say, there are no plans for that. Well, apart from my favourite project, HS2, which frees up a lot of commuter capacity. I think that's the only time I'm going to say anything about HS2, so there we go. I might find myself saying it again, but there we go. Of course, if you start thinking about spatial plans, you might start asking yourselves, well, does it really make sense to plan to accommodate, say, national businesses, forget international ones, national businesses and their headquarters in the city with the highest costs in Europe? Well, cost of living is slightly higher in Paris, so I'm told. That's what a national spatial plan should allow us to do. Think about where this population can be accommodated. This is crazy. Well, you know, other countries have them. The Netherlands has one. Ireland has one. Even our friends in Scotland, Ian, have one. A sort of national spatial plan where they can set out where everything might go over the next 5 or 10 years. What I have in mind is not some bureaucrat-driven process, however. What I have in mind is a tool for engagement between government and the private sector, between those who want to start and expand businesses and develop, and those who will try and help make sure this hangs together. This is a process that's going to have to be very different from the planning processes of the past, something that's accessible, an active instrument to engage developers and shape how we can best grow the economy. I think, in a sense, I'm describing the tool which I think the government is missing and being able to give expression to its rhetoric about rebalancing, or the part of rebalancing the economy spatially. And personally, it's just a personal view, I think if we engaged in that, of course you might end up with just the same thing that the market would give you. But I would personally hope that we get smart planning with development in urban areas and an intensification of cities and not continuous growth and sprawl into the countryside. And the second issue I mentioned, which was agglomeration, kind of will lead us that way. You, I hope, saw Evan Davis's brilliant Mind the Gap programme on BBC, which kind of gave expression to what agglomeration, which is a slightly strange mathematical construct, might be like in practice. You know, the buzz, the excitement, the trade-off, the conjoining of businesses and other activities in a single place. Because none of this is new. I mean, cities formed basically because of agglomeration benefits. It's where labour specialisation started way back when. Many people sort of ask if, well, actually, is this going to continue? I mean, this is a big picture. It can hardly be a bigger canvas. We don't often talk about these things, do we? But there we are. We're on a big canvas. The future of the nation, what it's going to look like. And people say, yeah, but, you know, with modern IT systems, I mean, mobile, this, that. I mean, people aren't going to bother with cities. All I'd say is look at what's happening in London and Paris right now, if that's what you think. With the agglomeration effect comes an intensification of development pressures. And so I think this is going to mean the opposite of the kind of development pattern we've seen through the 80s and 90s, and I have to say into the 2000s, which is ever more accretion around the edges of urban areas. I think we're going to move into, or back into, if you like, the transit age, because it's the only way to accommodate this stuff. It's pretty big investment in mass transit. The demographic pressures magnify through agglomeration this effect. Of course, each city is going to look at this differently. It's going to have to look to its own strengths to work out how it's going to evolve, because if it doesn't, it is going to fall by the wayside. It's a very competitive world out there. The competitive advantage of nations, then, I'm suggesting, is going to depend on the competitive, this is my thinking, this is what everybody else says, I'm just parroting it to you, on the competitive advantage of cities. Are they nice places to live? Do they give me a quality of life? And there's another aspect to that. Are they well connected? This is what Sir Rod Eddington pointed out. You know, 2 of the 3 things he said we needed to do, connect cities one with each other and connect them with what he then called global gateways. Those are features. They're important. They're about transport. So the third issue is the changing use of transport modes. So we've stopped building roads in the mid-1990s. And this is what's happened to demand by road, rail and domestic air since. This is passenger transport. I think the scale of the shift is perhaps not understood. Over longer distances, that's over 25 miles, 15 years ago, you'd find 8% of the demand was taken by the rail sector. It's now 14%. That is a massive shift. Still, of course, a tiny minority because car dominates the most dominated country in Europe. But that's a huge shift. People who've been doing demand modelling, those urban transport studies, used to put together the biggest package of pro-public transport and anti-car schemes that they could think of, run all these models, and quite honestly, you'd be quite pushed to get a modal split change of more than a couple of percent. It just didn't shift. My point is, over time, it is shifting. And our modelling is not very well equipped to pick up that kind of change. You can debate whether you think that's a trend that's going to continue in future, and lots of people are thinking about that. But it's a very, very big shift. We could talk about walk and cycling, And there's so many things I'm not touching on here. I'm going to offend so many of you. I'm hardly going to mention climate change and carbon and all the rest of it. Sorry. Just please don't make the first question. You didn't mention such and because there's a lot of that. Right, so let's move forward. A new model for transport planning. A great deal of transport planning activity is going on, but little of it is going into producing transport plans. But I think we need them because transport is, at its essence, a systems thing. Any intervention in transport over here has an impact just over there, and so on and so forth, whether it's a project, capacity, changing, the pricing, the fares, whatever. It all interacts. And I believe we need a new kind of updatable transport plan, a bit like the spatial plan I was describing. Something put together by the relevant stakeholders and something available as a tool. When I showed you the picture of Canary Wharf, for whom my consultancy worked for many years, in fact, right from the outset, the developers there turned around to me and said, how are we going to do this? I mean, a massive proposition to transform, a desert site, industrial site. We're going to have 80,000 people working here. Where, they asked, is the master plan for the Isle of Dogs? I said, well, we don't have one. Well, we need to produce one. Good plans are not the enemy of the most aggressive entrepreneurs imaginable. We have to move on from that. And the way we do it is to sit down and produce plans, I think, together. I think there's also different techniques you can use, and I borrowed this from a book produced by a couple of guys called Hickling and Friend. The book's called Planning Under Pressure. It was produced about nearly 20 years ago now, which suggests a way of thinking about planning which is disturbingly circular to most people. Of course, where do you ever get out of it? But you start in the top left. You start thinking about the objectives, and there are probably multiple objectives, and you'll only work out what they are if you sit down and ask people what they're trying to get out of it. You move around anti-clockwise. Well, what could help us meet these objectives? What's the best of those various ideas? That's a comparing bit, and then we might actually select and choose. And you might find at that stage you're a bit bothered and you might go back into the loop. Now, all of that sounds pretty scary, but I have applied this technique, and I know it works. In fact, I think it's the only comprehensive urban transport study I'm aware of in what in Ireland they call These Islands, which was the Dublin Transportation Initiative. It was pretty painful because there were a lot of conflicting views. We want a ring motorway, we want an underground metro, we want this, we'd like a light rail system. We need investment for pedestrians, we need a cycle network. What about the bus? It's all there. And it's a coherent program. And we used this technique, borrowed shamelessly, to try to thrash things out. So it's a bit of a different approach, and I think it's helpful in illustrating what's needed. Let's take one of the key issues of our time, which is, what will transport investment? So I do some of this planning, and I come up with a project. What's it actually going to do for, well, what have we asked? What's it going to do for jobs? What's it going to do for the economy? Well, first off, we've got to say, well, hopefully it's going to do a lot, because this government has got as its major capital spending department, I suspect for the first time, and sorry to defence colleagues here, it's transport. It's one. It's got 20% of the capital funding in the programme ahead. So it had better do things for the economy. One of our problems in looking at this and producing numbers about it is the assumption that when we look at a transport project, nothing else changes. just the way people find through the network, same for freight. And you can do that, and you'll still get some quantifiable benefits out of a transport investment. And it's probably not a bad shorthand way of looking at small-scale projects. But it's sure as eggs doesn't produce sensible answers for big projects. The idea that home or business location could actually change because of a transport investment. Pick one. Pick a different one. Crossrail 2. I mean, that's forbidden. It's not allowed. Conventional cost-benefit appraisals, where transport is linked with development, does not work. And those are actually the transport changes we're probably most interested in. Because we're interested in creating jobs and promoting this area or that. If the aim is really economic development, we can't seek to recognize that just by measuring changes in transport efficiency and benefits to users, where you could do if you allowed everything to change, but where we don't allow everything to change. And we need dynamic models to look at that question. And there are some now becoming available, and they're pretty well suited to this kind of thinking, testing scenarios and so on. What I'm saying is, I'm afraid, radical, but the pretense that house prices, business locations, car purchase decisions, life expectancy, we assume all those things are fixed and unchangeable by anything we choose to do. Well, I mean, it's just a nonsense. All of those things actually are affected by these decisions that we're looking at. We don't need to assume they're fixed, is my contention. We've also got another little issue to worry about, which is we're very good at dealing with averages. And that kind of works well when there are average people. But income distributions have been getting more skewed, actually, for quite a long time, as far as I can see, since 1976, if you want to put a year on it. It's not just a recent phenomenon. But that means looking at assumptions about how average people will respond to things like, well, here's a better service, and but we'll charge you more for it, gets quite tricky. What about those people who basically don't have much money? They don't travel. Are we just going to leave them out of the analysis or whatever? We've got to think a bit more about those things. So what am I saying? I'm saying transport's a system. We've got to be a bit wary, although I am seriously praising these building blocks, as I've called them, as a great step forward. We've got to be a bit wary about progressing, looking at modes in isolation. We need new processes that will engage the private sector. We've got to stop working with fixed assumptions. Just relax, everybody. They can be allowed to change. And I think we've got to be careful about the fact that for travel, as in other things, we're not dealing with a single central person or homogeneity. So let's just move towards thinking about, well, what's actually going to come out of this transport planning process? And I've got to put another challenge in front of you. City leaders, if you talk to them, talk about placemaking. And they see the role of transport through a number of lenses. One's the jobs and employment agenda, but the other is what it does to their public realm, to their streetscape. And I saw this very visibly. I was a member of a West End Commission reporting last year. Transport planners would look at the streets of the West End, cue slide of Monopoly board to remind you where they are. And look at these streets as sort of places where you've got to work out how you're going to reconcile the demands of bus services, taxis, cyclists, pedestrians, delivery vehicles, construction vehicles, emergency vehicles. This is before you worry about growth. They're all there now. Delivery vehicles are growing hugely, as you know. But the streets and squares of the West End of London, and actually the centre of every city and town, are really rather special places. They're kind of almost, in the London case, brands in their own right. They're what define the place. They codify what London's like for all of us. So we just regard them as part of a transport system. It's not really going to work going forward because we're trying to create attractive, pleasant places. So transport and logistics are going to probably have to play a much cleverer, subservient role within that. I've talked about a need for a national spatial plan. London has its own pretty rough spatial plan. Every city and urban area in the country deserves the right. In fact, it deserves to have the obligation to produce one. You might say, well, it ain't going to make much money. It ain't going to make much difference. Comes to the same thing. But, you know, the case for Crossrail, as initially developed, was around solving a transport problem. It was, I think, when the London mayor had set out a plan for London that said 600,000 new jobs in the centre of London, and incidentally, they stretched from the West End through the city into Docklands, that it became so much easier to convince politicians. And it was Gordon Brown at the time who had to be convinced, and he was pretty reluctant on these things, that this was an absolutely necessary development for this city. No plans, spatial plans, are the key, I think, to successful transport planning. The other thing I just wanted to say was about things at a project level. Because, of course, we do need to think about the interdependencies between transport projects. We're living in a world where, while we don't have plans, there are plenty of projects. Our apparent inability to have one project interface with another is frustrating. How can we, oh, damn it, I'm mentioning it again, I do apologise. How can we contemplate a high-speed rail network without knowing what we're going to do with our national hub airport capacity? And that really is an obstacle. And I'd say, well, this is the kind of issue, this interface issue, is what transport plans are there for. They're there to play with the jigsaw pieces and try different fits and see what works best and try and carry as many people along with us as possible. But actually that sounds like old jolly good common sense, good systems thinking. It's actually anathema to the poor person charged with delivering one of these transport projects. The last thing they want is project interfaces that might hold up successful delivery on time and on budget, the thing they're held to account for. But I think we're really here talking about cost effectiveness. Let me give you an example. It's easier and much less costly to rebuild Euston Station, which is on there somewhere. I can't remember where it is on the board. It's there somewhere. Who's played Monopoly recently? It's not there. Euston was never on the Monopoly board. There you are, that's the problem. It'd be so much easier to do it if the commuter trains that run into it didn't run into it. They could run into Crossrail. It's not difficult to do. Everybody knows there's a good business case to do it. But it kind of cuts across project definitions. Is that high-speed rail, which seems to be driving demand? Actually, you need to rebuild Euston anyway. Is it there, or is it a Crossrail problem? Well, hang on, we're building Crossrail. You can't change it. But just think of the benefits. It improves the business case for Crossrail itself. It'll reduce the cost of rebuilding Euston. It'll provide a string of commuter towns with access to Crossrail. In fact, I put them on the Crossrail map. In fact, the West Coast suburban services go through an area called the Chilterns. I've heard of them. And it will take pressure off London Underground. But we find these things incredibly difficult to do. Why? We have no transport plan We have no transport plans that allow us to look at these things fitting together. A transport plan that, of course, would have to be updatable and adaptable. It can't be like that old vision that I suggested we started with. Here it is, we'll dream it up, and in the end we'll impose it. It doesn't work, but we do need something, I think, in its place. We do need transport planning, and we need a flexible, updated approach. Now, last thing, National Transport Plan. Can we have one of those? Well, oh, sorry, that was a picture of a West Coast Main Line commuter train that's meant to feed into Crossrail. I, rather doubt that we're going to get a national transport plan in my lifetime. I've waited a long time for one, and I think actually it's probably not going to happen. And the reason why is if you produce one, you have to codify a couple of things that are rather awkward. You have to admit that we have more demand for our dominant mode, which is the road network, our dominant network, than we can possibly accommodate. We've got a lot of suppressed demand. We've got actually a very big highway investment program at the moment, but the department's projections are, having invested all that money, the strategic highway network, in which all the funds are going to go, is going to be more congested than it is today. Not as congested as it would be if you didn't spend all that money, but it's going to be worse. So how can you write a national transport plan if you're not prepared to say that and say, well, look, that's what would happen if we did this? I think a national strategy could actually appeal to an awful lot of people. I think it could actively seek to create a sustainable future rather than just look at things that are going to come along and try and mitigate impacts. I think it could point even to a program of some road investment, provided that the aim was to reduce the impacts of road traffic. Because I'm still in a world where I've been for 45 years where we're not charging for road use properly. That might change. You could then change your profile on road investment policy. So what am I saying? I'm saying transport's a system. We've got to be a bit wary, although I am seriously praising these building blocks, as I've called them, as a great step forward. We've got to be a bit wary about progressing, looking at modes in isolation. We need new processes that will engage the private sector. We've got to stop working with fixed assumptions. Just relax, everybody. They can be allowed to change. And I think we've got to be careful about the fact that for travel, as in other things, we're not dealing with a single central person or homogeneity. So let's just move towards thinking about, well, what's actually going to come out of this transport planning process? And I've got to put another challenge in front of you. City leaders, if you talk to them, talk about placemaking. They see the role of transport through a number of lenses. One's the jobs and employment agenda, but the other is what it does to their public realm, to their streetscape. And I saw this very visibly. I was a member of a West End Commission reporting last year. Transport planners would look at the streets of the West End, cue slide of Monopoly board to remind you where they are. And look at these streets as sort of places where you've got to work out how you're going to reconcile the demands of bus services, taxis, cyclists, pedestrians, delivery vehicles, construction vehicles, emergency vehicles. This is before you worry about growth. They're all there now. Delivery vehicles are growing hugely, as you know. But the streets and squares of the West End of London, and actually the centre of every city and town, are really rather special places. They're kind of almost, in the London case, brands in their own right. They're what define the place. They codify what London's like for all of us. So we just regard them as part of a transport system. It's not really going to work going forward because we're trying to create attractive, pleasant places. So transport and logistics are going to probably have to play a much cleverer, subservient role within that. I've talked about a need for a national spatial plan. London has its own pretty rough spatial plan. Every city and urban area in the country deserves the right. In fact, it deserves to have the obligation to produce one. You might say, well, it ain't going to make much money. It ain't going to make much difference. Comes to the same thing. But, you know, the case for Crossrail, as initially developed, was around solving a transport problem. It was, I think, when the London mayor had set out a plan for London that said 600,000 new jobs in the centre of London, and incidentally, they stretched from the West End through the city into Docklands, that it became so much easier to convince politicians. And it was Gordon Brown at the time who had to be convinced, and he was pretty reluctant on these things, that this was an absolutely necessary development for this city. No plans, spatial plans, are the key, I think, to successful transport planning. The other thing I just wanted to say was about things at a project level. Because, of course, we do need to think about the interdependencies between transport projects. We're living in a world where, while we don't have plans, there are plenty of projects. Our apparent inability to have one project interface with another is frustrating. How can we, oh damn it, I'm mentioning it again, I do apologise. How can we contemplate a high-speed rail network without knowing what we're going to do with our national hub airport capacity? And that really is an obstacle. And I'd say, well, this is the kind of issue, this interface issue, is what transport plans are there for. They're there to play with the jigsaw pieces and try different fits and see what works best and try and carry as many people along with us as possible. But actually that sounds like all jolly good common sense, good systems thinking. It's actually anathema to the poor person charged with delivering one of these transport projects. The last thing they want is project interfaces that might hold up successful delivery on time and on budget, the thing they're held to account for. But I think we're really here talking about cost effectiveness. Let me give you an example. It's easier and much less costly to rebuild Euston Station, which is on there somewhere. I can't remember where it is on the board. It's there somewhere. Who's played Monopoly recently? It's not there. Euston was never on the Monopoly board. There you are, that's the problem. It'd be so much easier to do it if the commuter trains that run into it didn't run into it. They could run into Crossrail. It's not difficult to do. Everybody knows there's a good business case to do it. But it kind of cuts across project definitions. Is that high-speed rail, which seems to be driving demand? Actually, you need to rebuild Euston anyway. Is it there, or is it a Crossrail problem? Well, hang on, we're building Crossrail. You can't change it. But just think of the benefits. It improves the business case for Crossrail itself. It'll reduce the cost of rebuilding Euston. It'll provide a string of commuter towns with access to Crossrail. In fact, I put them on the Crossrail map. In fact, the West Coast suburban services go through an area called the Chilterns. I've heard of them. And it will take pressure off London Underground. But we find these things incredibly difficult to do. Why? We have no transport plan. We have no transport plans that allow us to look at these things fitting together. A transport plan that, of course, would have to be updatable and adaptable. It can't be like that old vision that I suggested we started with. Here it is, we'll dream it up, and in the end we'll impose it. It doesn't work. But we do need something, I think, in its place. We do need transport planning. and we need a flexible, updated approach. Now, last thing, National Transport Plan. Can we have one of those? Well, oh, sorry, that was a picture of a West Coast Main Line commuter train that's meant to feed into Crossrail. I, rather doubt that we're going to get a National Transport Plan in my lifetime. I've waited a long time for one, and I think actually it's probably not going to happen. And the reason why is if you produce one, you have to codify a couple of things that are rather awkward. You have to admit that we have more demand for our dominant mode, which is the road network, our dominant network, than we can possibly accommodate. We've got a lot of suppressed demand. We've got actually a very big highway investment program at the moment, but the department's projections are, having invested all that money, the strategic highway network in which all the funds are going to go is going to be more congested than it is today. Not as congested as it would be if you didn't spend all that money, but it's going to be worse. So how can you write a national transport plan if you're not prepared to say that and say, well, look, that's what would happen if we did this? I think a national strategy could actually appeal to an awful lot of people. I think it could actively seek to create a sustainable future rather than just look at things that are going to come along and try and mitigate impacts. I think it could point even to a program of some road investment, provided that the aim was to reduce the impacts of road traffic. Because I'm still in a world where I've been for 45 years where we're not charging for road use properly. That might change. You could then change your profile on road investment policy. You end up here, I think, with differentiated but complementary policies. I mean, this is a very, very old issue, the role of the road network and the rail network. And I think this is the policy balance that you would go for. You would look to expand the rail network, use of which covers external costs through charges. And you look to reduce the adverse effects of the road network. So I think they can be usefully differentiated, and you could piece that together in some kind of strategy, but somehow I rather suspect we won't see it. And anyway, there is a problem, because people say the rail network, it doesn't do very much. I mean, it's great if you're in London or, a few other places, the old 3,000 dotted around the country that happen to have a station. It doesn't do anything like the road network does for us in a comprehensive way. Well, I'll just share this with you really as a bit of a laugh. I was asked in 2007 to produce a vision of what the rail network in Britain might look like in 2057. 2057, that's right, it was a 50-year forward look. This was for ATOC. So remember, this was in 2007. I sort of boldly said, well, there you are, there's a high-speed rail line. There's actually a set of other rail links that we should have, joining up bits of the country that are not joined up. Not old-fashioned branch lines, I'm afraid, but decent links that create a network. If you look at the southwest very carefully, you'll even find a Dawlish bypass built in there. Now, that was prescient, wasn't it? But the most important thing probably are the sort of circles of city-region networks that we really haven't thought about. We kind of got there in London, and we will have got there with Crossrail and Thameslink. But we haven't really started to think about it for the other great cities which struggle on with what they've got. But sketches like these are just that. They break one of my rules, which is you can't just think of some modes on their own. There's all kinds of fun things in here. There's a Channel Tunnel to the Republic of Ireland. You look carefully. There's lots of good things there. Anyway, we should conclude. I think we should be past the era, and we have to be, where planning was seen as the enemy of market-led growth. Transport and logistics have systems characteristics writ large in a way that perhaps has never been done before. And I think they'd welcome that. I think that if we do that, we can provide transport plans that will help this problem of interfacing transport projects. And at the end of all that, of course, I hope it will create cities and other places that we'd all like to live in, remembering that's what we're really trying to do. So that's what I think I've outlined. I think it's an exciting challenge ahead. And thank you very much for listening.
First question.
Jim, Martin Brennan, CILT Rail Strategy Forum. Thanks for a memorable speech. You've raised the exciting prospect of better dynamic modelling going forward. But, you know, most mornings, people who ought to know better on the Today programme mix up correlation and causality. Another factor, I guess, is that, you know, whatever you do in the commercial world tends to bring along a market reaction, which may be one of the reasons why governments have shied away from sort of ports strategies. So my question really is, you know, what level of confidence do you think such new models will be able to bring to sorting out the individual factors for transport and land use, and also the systems of factors to which you've alluded?
Well, let me just answer that pretty briefly by saying there are a whole set of things that actually don't change very much that we know that if you feed into these models would be quite helpful. Let me give you a couple of pointers. One would be, if you look at the population of the major provincial cities in this country, provided you define them as city regions, they haven't changed for decades. So the central population of Liverpool has gone down. You take the Liverpool city region, it's about the same as it was. We live in a world where there's excess demand. I mean, if you suddenly improve things, we're about to in London, Crossrail and Thameslink, there's going to be additional demand released on the network. We know that peak demand growth has been suppressed for a very long time, you know, and then politicians say, well, let's imagine we can spread the peak by charging more. Well, you know, if you step back and start thinking about these things and stop worrying about trying to force them into the, you know, very clever modelling systems that we've got, just say, well, what do we know? Let's try and describe it. The worry of causation, I think, disappears a little bit. Some things I just think we do know about the patterns of demand and what's likely to happen. And I see I haven't convinced you, so we'll continue this over tea or coffee. It's an interesting question. Thank you for it.
Richard Brown, formerly Eurostar, currently non-executive HS2. Jim, thank you very much indeed for a very stimulating, thought-provoking presentation. You talk about collaboration between the public and private sector. The main place that is happening outside of London is the local enterprise partnerships, which in some cases are beginning to take a lead and think about the very issues you're talking about, but they don't have the resources and the people to do it. How would you advise them to get engaged and equip themselves to actually have an impact and do some of the things you're suggesting?
Well, and in fairness to them, you know, they were very underfunded initially. They then sort of gradually got some funding, and now they've been told they've got to bid for things. So it's hardly a conducive environment in which to do the kind of thing I'm talking about, which might take a little while to nurture people around to saying, well, look, come on, we need to decide this stuff and work it out together. It's extremely difficult to do that. I mean, they've just been producing their strategic economic plans. These are huge tomes, you know. It's got to be evidence-based, all those good things that everybody who's been doing these things knows are requirements. So I think the LEPs are an interesting experiment. I'm not really sure they're going to survive in the current form. I can say that in my experience before the LEPs, the Northern Way worked pretty well. It was private and public sector brought together, and it did look at some of these issues. We had long enough, in fairness. It took 3 years, I'd say, to get to the point where we could say, you know what, if there's one thing, just one thing, why only one thing? Well, it makes you decide. One thing you want to do in the whole of the north of England, northwest Yorkshire, Humber, northeast England, it would be to sort out the rail network in the middle of Manchester. It took 3 years to get there. So you've got to be, but those private and public sector sat down from all kinds of different places, all got their own agenda. Now, what's it going to do for me? A little bit. Oh, all right. So you've got to be patient. You've got to be prepared to work on these things, and very few organisations are given that chance. It's going to be difficult.
Alex Nelson from Chester-le-Track in County Durham, where we do indeed still have a congestion charging zone. It's only a little one, but we do have one. The question I was going to ask is about the Abercrombie report from 1944 that proposed a green belt all around London, which still exists. And I was wondering if, in the light of population increases that you expect in London, when producing the spatial plan, that green belt should be defended at all costs, or relaxed completely, or probably somewhere in between.
There's somebody from CPRE in the audience, so I've got to go carefully here. Well, you know, that's what you have to weigh up when you're producing a spatial plan. I mean, if you listen to the news, house builders are being encouraged, in effect, to get on and build houses and get on with it. And if it's in the green belt, so what? That's where people want to live. All I'd say is that the consequences of that kind of thinking is that we don't really know what we're going to end up with. And we ought, it seems to me, to be allowed as a nation to sit down and debate and discuss these things. It's certainly true that if the green belt around London is protected, we're going to have to think about where expansion in the southeast is going to go. And it's still going to be tough, just because it's not in the green belt. And it's going to require quite a lot more long-distance commuting, which people tend to say is a bad thing. You know, they're difficult choices, but I think we need to give ourselves the opportunity to think about them. And of course, other cities have got pretty similar things in the rest of the country.
Yes, Stephen Joseph, Campaign for Better Transport. Thanks very much, Jim, for a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I thought it was very good. You and I and lots of other people have said over many years that we need to move away from forecasts-based transport planning, where you have fixed assumptions, where land use is fixed, and so on. Perhaps more now than ever before, actually saying that. There is a bunch of people in the department who resist this absolutely. To what do you, and who kind of want to keep to the eternal verities, to what do you ascribe that kind of stubbornness, and what do you think could change it and make the kind of transport planning you've talked about actually come to be a reality?
So shock therapy has got to be the answer, isn't it? I mean, get a few other people to give a more polished version of this kind of talk, I suppose, and think through the worrying outcome of just continuing like that. I mean, in practice, what will have to happen is a sort of parallel set of worlds. I mean, there is a perfectly legitimate mindset that says, I would like to know what the impact of this thing is, as best we can tell, on the basis of the established and still evolving methodology. Well, fine, that's fantastic. Just don't use that to define what the future of this country is going to look like. That is not a way to develop a transport plan or a national spatial plan for this country. To get at that, you need a completely different approach. So that's great for looking at projects up to a point, probably only if they're small scale and don't have these wider impacts. I mean, I know you'd say there's all kinds of weaknesses with them, you know, they don't cover the, I mean, a lot of things that are fixable. But they're just not good enough to look at the bigger picture questions. And I do think we got some big questions. I mean, I'd invite you all to go home and do the sum on how many extra million people you think there are going to be working in London and where they might live, and just what that means for the transport system. Well, these are not minimal, trivial questions. Or do you think, well, it might be a good idea if they worked somewhere else? I mean, what is the... I mean, I have a horror... Let me confess. I mean, I've lived in London for, 45 years, actually. I don't like the way it's developing. I don't like the fact that there are a huge number of towers going to be built that I have a horrible feeling are not going to be very productive. Many of them are going to be empty, and it's not going to improve the appeal of this city for people to live and work in. Now, that's a very, very personal view, but, you know, we should be allowed to think about these things. Even the architectural correspondents only sort of say reluctant, have you looked at this plan? Have you looked what the South Bank of the Thames is going to look like in 20 years' time? You know, we should be thinking about these things. What do you really want it to be like?
John Cartledge, lately of London Travel Watch. Jim, in practically every other sentence of your address, you use the personal pronoun we. And I want to be clear who we is in the context that you've been speaking. Does it mean the people in this room who have I suspect in every case, a powerful professional interest in addressing the sorts of challenges that you've instanced, or does it mean the political class, or does it mean society at large? Because society at large, unless their immediate well-being is directly threatened by the prospect of HS2 coming through their back garden, are largely indifferent to transport issues. Although they spend a lot of their time travelling, they spend a lot of their money on transport, it's off the political radar. And certainly at the national political level, the Department of Transport is the graveyard that no aspirant politician wants to end up in, with one or two slightly eccentric examples. Why should it be any different in the future? Why shouldn't everybody else who's got more interesting and more important things to focus on be content to muddle through as we have until now without any grand visions of the kind that you've been painting?
Well, so, thanks, John. I think when I did use we, I was thinking of we the people of the country, and I hope I made clear this was a pretty personal opinion, and I would expect a lot of people in the room to say, well, I agree with some of that, but I didn't agree with that, and so on, because, you know, the profession's got a range of views about this stuff. Why should they care? I think they won't care unless they think about the future. But, you know, I'm trying to think of some parallels. But there are policy issues around which people get very distressed about. You can probably think of them, and they think, oh, I think I may vote differently, you know. They're thinking about the future of their country. I'm saying that if you think about the transport future of this country, you also may see a world that you don't really like the look of, but you do have the opportunity to shape through really doing reintroducing, as it were, the notion of transport planning. It may be far-fetched, but that's what I happen to think. And I don't agree with you, actually, about the standard line as it is, forgive me, on transport ministers. If you get to be head of the department that's got the biggest capital budget, you kind of got something to do. You know, at the end of it, you know, your little stint, and of course it's hopelessly short, as you point out, well, no, I got that going, I got that through. I'll be able to turn around and look at it. Precious few other department ministers get any of that. They just don't have it. I think transport, yes, of course a lot of people, if you stop and ask, they'll say, well, I don't care, I care more about other things. But I think for ministers, it's actually quite an interesting area now.
Terry Hill. Yeah, Terry Hill from Harrop and various other projects. I want to talk about the profession or the discipline of transport planning and ask you where you think it'll be going next. Because as you were saying, I totally agree with you with the huge budget of infrastructure and transport investment going forward. Then if you were a minister or a senior civil servant and had all this money, surely you'd ask transport planners what's the best way of going about it. But behind a lot of what you were saying, and by the way, I thought it was a fantastic tour de force and also candid, because I'm sure a lot of us can go through you know, the projects that have not worked the way we thought, that have not gone the way we thought, and what is it that's behind that? And you said in the middle of that how the profession and the discipline has evolved over time. So I started scribbling it down, and I've got a slightly different way, but and over decades, and I'll try and go a bit further back than you. 1950s, beginning of the 1,000 miles of motorway to be built in the country was what we can afford. 1960s, I think economics started coming in. 1970s, of course, environmental impact statements and what to do about that. 1980s, I think it might have been a bit of sociology. We started doing traffic surveys with journey purpose as well, where on earth it was. So what's behavioural stuff? 90s was probably PFIs. So what we're going to do next? And just to help you, I was going to suggest two things. One is, behind what you were saying, we always dismiss the decision that was taken a different way as, oh, that was just politics. That was what... And therefore, do we really understand political science? Do we really understand what drives the political decisions that we do all the... Or, so that's one, or the other way is, surely we are so smart now. Actually, with big data and crowdsourcing, we probably have perfect knowledge about people's behaviour now, which is at least an improvement of what we used to have. And therefore, will technology be able to add to transport planning as a science? So anyway, the question is, where's the discipline and the profession going?
Blimey. Well, thank you. Terry and I share views on these things through the decades, I think it's fair to say. I don't think sociology featured in the 1980s, but apart from that, yes, I agree with that. Well, I think where ministers turn to is to economics. They turn to the economist. The economics mind is the mind which has determined transport policy. And it's obviously extremely valuable, but it's not the only mind. If transport's a system, and you start thinking about how you want it to work, you need to have people with an operational mind. Dare I say it, sometimes an engineering mind. That's not unusual in other countries, but it is kind of rare in this country. And the great joy to me of transport planning is the fact that it can embrace all of those disciplines. I mean, I think, you know, this is the huge challenge for transport planners. You ought to know something about how places get shaped. You ought to understand the economic relations that the transport economists embed themselves in. You ought to understand how things operate and the feasibility of making them operate better and building things and so on. So I'm afraid transport planners are going to have to be pretty much all-rounders. Of course, I mean, people just end up choosing to specialise, and, you know, that leaves the field for people like you to be visionary and help direct them, Terry.
It's Martin Tugwell from the Transport Systems Catapult. You've talked about engaging with different sectors. One sector you haven't talked about engaging with, and perhaps is missing in the conversation, is the consumer. Because we're talking here as professionals, we're talking about engaging with the private sector, but actually transport is there for the consumer, and the consumer is getting smarter in many instances. And if you look at many of the policies from government, is actually emphasising the personalisation agenda for purchasing transport more as a service than a utility. So how do you see the challenge being addressed for the profession of actually engaging with the consumer rather than just ourselves or providers?
Right, you're absolutely right, Martin. I just sort of put that to one side. And the reason why I put it to one side is, in the end, I realised I was ending up talking a lot about infrastructure. And I apologise for that, because the area you're talking about is massively important. And I think many of us can see the way it's going. And the way it's going is towards creating a set of businesses that try to respond to consumers. And there's another conflict here with people who'd rather that didn't happen. They'd rather that actually there was a sort of national standard system that you all subscribe to that looked after you. I mean, that's not going to happen. We don't live in that world. So this is, you know, the existence of consumers looking for better information, better guidance, better deals and so on is going to lead to a whole set of new industries. And the poor people who get the tedious job, I mean, the logistics people discovered this a few years back, didn't they? I mean, just running a truck up and down, I mean, you want to be in the business of solving problems for people. So it's the equivalent of that in personal travel, I'm sure is going to happen. The point is, I don't really see that mechanism as being a key driver for how this kind of planning has got to be resolved. I mean, it's true that you can look at big data, you can do all kinds of things now which will help you do service planning, infrastructure planning better. And yes, somewhere in there features the consumer, but you know, I can't quite see how you could sit alongside your professional planning facilitator, your private sector, and sort of a few consumer representatives. I don't think that's going to work, but you're right. Somehow we've got to make sure it works for individuals and for the rich variety of individuals that you know make up the population. That's a good point.
I'd like to ask Daniel Parker-Klein, Head of Policy for the Institute and Director of PTRC, to come up to the lectern to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Jolyon. Good evening. On behalf of CILT, I would like to thank Jim for coming here this evening. It has been an engaging and thought-provoking lecture. We have all seen the central role that transport planning has played in creating the society, environment and economy that we've lived, environment that we live in today. But lessons must be drawn from the past to face our current unprecedented challenges. And we see how a National Spatial Plan can provide the framework in which transport can develop in partnership with the private sector. Now, a clear sign of good talk is that an interesting discussion follows, and that has certainly happened this evening. Thank you, Jim, again for your timely and important lecture.
It was an absolutely stunning talk. It covered so much ground and opened a large number of agendas with a new paradigm for us to follow. And it's absolutely in line with what the Public Policies Committee are doing on Vision 2035. And I'm very mindful that the demographic we saw is now twice the length of Vision 2035. So we're going to have to think ahead, and it's quite scary. Please go upstairs and have a drink and continue the discussion. On the table where you came in are copies of Transport and the Economy, which is a paper that was started by Jim about exactly what it says, and copies of Jim's talk for you to take away with you. And I'm going to ask you for another round of applause because he's absolutely worth it. And thank you all for coming.